everyone, welcome to your Learn Lab. I'm Seema, and if you're an IGNOU student, you're in the right place. Here we create videos on different IGNOU courses to help you ace your exams. So hit subscribe and join me on this learning journey. In today's video, we are kicking off Block 2 of MEG-01 British Poetry with something foundational, the literary and historical background of the English Renaissance. Now, before we jump into poets like Spenser or Sidney, it's important to first understand the world they lived and wrote in. This video will walk you through the big ideas, cultural shifts, and historical forces that shaped Renaissance literature in England. Why does this matter? Because once you get the background, everything else, the themes, the style, even the poetic form starts to make more sense. And from an IGNOU exam point of view, this is a high-yield unit. These background questions are asked often and can really boost your confidence across the paper. Let's take a quick look at what you'll learn in this lesson. We'll begin with a broad understanding of what Renaissance was, then narrow down to how it unfolded in England, which was quite different from how it emerged in Italy. We'll explore the powerful ideas of humanism, the effect of the Protestant Reformation, and how poetry was both personal and political during this time. Toward the end, we'll go over exam questions that frequently appear from this block, so you're not just learning passively but preparing strategically. Let's begin by answering the question, what do we really mean by Renaissance? Renaissance, it means rebirth. Originating in Italy during the 14th century, it marked a revival of classical thought, arts, and values from ancient Greece and Rome. This rebirth emphasized human potential and individual achievement, leading to developments in literature, science, art, and philosophy. While Italy had Petrarch, Boccaccio, and Leonardo da Vinci, England's Renaissance arrived later, but with a powerful voice through poets like Spenser, Sidney, and eventually Shakespeare. For exams, remember the Renaissance is both a literary as well as an intellectual movement. It's not just about art, but about how literature reflected a new way of seeing the world. This sets the stage for our next discussion, how the English version of the Renaissance diverged from the Italian model. So, the Renaissance began in continental Europe, especially Italy, following the fall of Constantinople in 1493. Refugees brought classical Greek learning to Italy, which inspired major thinkers like Ficino and Pico della Mirandola. Their ideas later influenced early English humanists like John Colet and William Lilly. However, England was slow to adopt these ideas. Its language was still politically weak, dominated by Latin and French, and there was no mature literary tradition like in Italy. It was only when poets like Wyatt and Surrey translated Latin and Italian verse into English that English Renaissance literature truly began. The printing press also helped by spreading classical texts in the vernacular and encouraging national literary traditions. But the English Renaissance diverged from the continental version in several key ways. One, it was deeply shaped by the Protestant Reformation, which added a strong moral and spiritual tone to English humanism. It was less elitist, it engaged with local traditions like folk poetry and ballads and reached a wider literate audience. It fostered a distinct sense of national identity, driven by political shift and the ambition to rival ancient Greece and Rome. Poets like Edmund Spenser embodied this blend of classical form, Christian ethics, and patriotic pride, something we'll study in detail soon. Let's now explore how one of the most influential forces, humanism, redefined the concept of the individual and shaped literature. Humanism was the intellectual engine that allowed the movement to travel from Italy to England. Humanists did not reject Christianity. They wanted to recover the moral wisdom of the ancients and fuse it with faith. Petrarch's search for forgotten Latin manuscripts in monastic libraries sparked a Europe-wide treasure hunt. In the north, Erasmus produced new critical editions of the Bible. In England, John Collett's lectures on St. Paul and Thomas More's Utopia showed how classical learning could reform society. Crucially, Humanists revolutionized education. Newly founded grammar schools taught Studia Humanitatis, creating a literate generation that could read Cicero in the morning and Tyndale's English New Testament at night. Caxton's printing press, 1476, multiplied affordable books, letting ideas leap from court to tavern. Humanism's celebration of individual worth and moral inquiry set the stage for the next seismic shift, the Reformation, where questions of personal conscience would append the religious map of Europe. With that mindset in place, we can now examine how reformers like Luther and Tyndale turned readers into theologians and indirectly critics and poets. Let's focus on one of the most defining historical influences on the English Renaissance now, the Reformation. The Reformation began as a movement to reform the Roman Catholic Church. It gained momentum in the 14th and 15th centuries and took a dramatic turn when Martin Luther posted his 95 Theses in 1517. This sparked a wave of religious upheaval around Europe. Thanks to the printing press, translated versions of the Bible became widely available. This broke the monopoly of the church over religious interpretation and empowered common people to read and understand scripture directly. In England, John Wycliffe had already started this process with his early translation efforts, and later William Tyndale's accessible Bible made an even bigger impact. In 1535, King Henry VIII broke from the Roman Catholic Church and established the Church of England, making the Reformation a political as well as a religious movement. Various Protestant sects flourished, including the Diggers, Quakers, and Presbyterians. This shift deeply affected the tone of English literature. Unlike the more sensuous and free-spirited Italian Renaissance, the English version was tempered by Christian ethics and moral seriousness. You'll notice this tension in Renaissance literature, a love for classical beauty and form, constantly checked by religious reflection and national ideology. Understanding this context is crucial when analyzing poetry from this period, especially works like The Faerie Queene, which mix classical learning with Christian allegory. Let's now explore the social and political changes that set the stage of the Renaissance in England. In the 15th century, England was still a feudal and agrarian society, but the Black Death and other plague drastically reduced the population. This created a labor shortage that allowed some peasants to rise economically. A new class emerged, the yeomen, or the small landowners. Many aristocrats turned to pasture farming and wool production, leading to the enclosure of land and abandonment of rural villages. At the same time, London was booming, economically and politically. People migrated to the city for work and opportunity. The result? A new mixed urban society, artisans, merchants, and middle-class workers. Protestant reformers reached this group with literacy campaigns and Bible translations. These changes produced a literary audience hungry for both learning and moral guidance. Add to this the shifting monarchies from Henry VIII to Edward VI to Mary Tudor to Elizabeth I, and you get a politically unstable but culturally vibrant period. What held this together was a strong sense of English nationalism. English writers began to reject Italian ideals and try to create a uniquely English voice. They borrowed forms and genres from Europe but adapted them, infusing them with Anglican morality and native linguistic rhythms. This is the cultural space that poets like Spenser wrote in. Their work is both elevated and local, classical and Christian, personal and political. Next, we'll see how this all played out in court life and the fascinating relationship between poets and the monarchy. One of the most fascinating features of English Renaissance is the intertwining of poetry and politics. Most Renaissance poets were courtiers, men who served the royal court and used poetry as a social and rhetorical tool. Writers like Wyatt, Sidney, Raleigh, and Spenser weren't just poets. They were diplomats, soldiers, or administrators. Poetry circulated in manuscript shared among elite peers, often addressed to powerful patrons. It was not meant for public publishing, but for selective performance. Interestingly, poets of this era often apologized for their own poetry. They called it a personal indulgence, a result of idle hours, or something unworthy of serious attention. But this self-deprecation was part of both poetic tradition and courtly etiquette. It allowed the poet to display talent while remaining humble before the monarch. This attitude is captured beautifully in lines like Sidney's in Sonnet 34. What idler thing than speak and not be heard? What harder thing than smart and not to speak? Here the poet claims that the pain of love drives him to write even though passion clouds his wit. In denying his ability to write well, he paradoxically proves his emotional depth, and that's the poetic point. This pose of modesty came from a larger European idea of the ideal courtier, shaped by Castiglione's The Book of the Courtier. According to this influential text, a good courtier was accomplished, witty, and learned, but never boastful. He had to appear graceful and modest even when performing with brilliance. So poetry was never just an art. It was a part of a public performance of identity, allegiance, and refinement. For poets like Sidney, this came naturally. For poets like Spenser, who came from outside the nobility, this created tension, which we will explore in our next video. Let's now explore English nationalism, a powerful force shaping Renaissance literature, especially by the late 16th century. Although nationalism fully matures in the 17th century, we can trace its growth back to the Protestant Reformation and England's break from Rome. As England distanced itself politically and spiritually from Catholic Europe, a sense of separate English identity began to take root. Unlike later European nationalisms which emerged after the secularization of society, English nationalism was closely tied to religion. Protestantism, especially Anglicanism, became a cultural and ideological anchor for national pride. This movement was not just limited to the aristocracy. It was deeply rooted in the middle classes, traders, merchants, and professionals who were gaining economic power thanks to England's growing global trade, agriculture, and cloth industry. National pride became a tool for social mobility and was reinforced through Protestant teaching and English language Bibles. Writers like Edmund Spenser expressed their ambition to create a uniquely English literature, one that could rival the epics of classical and continental traditions. This desire culminated in efforts like The Faerie Queene, which Spenser envisioned as a national English epic. Ironically, it wasn't until the nationalist ideology itself was under threat in the 17th century, during civil war and religious conflict, that England would finally produce such an epic in Milton's Paradise Lost. Still, the roots of that ambition were laid in the Renaissance. So as you read the poetry of this era, look for that pride in language, culture, and identity. It's not just an art, it's nation building. Let's pause for a moment and look at how this background is tested in your MEG-01 exams. These are typical exam-style questions drawn from your previous years. You might be asked to compare the English and Italian Renaissance, especially in terms of religion and literature. Describe how the Protestant Reformation impacted themes and tones in English poetry. Explain how court life and patronage shaped the work of poets like Sidney or Wyatt. Or discuss Spenser's nationalism and how he tried to write an English literary epic. And of course, humanism, the intellectual core of the Renaissance, is a must-know. If you can explain these with relevant examples from writers and their works, you will be able to write solid, detailed answers that hit all the key points. Let's quickly recap everything we've covered so far. The English Renaissance was a time of vibrant literary and cultural change. It blended the influence of classical humanism with spiritual intensity of the Protestant Reformation and the complex social rituals of courtly life. Poets weren't just writing verse, they were shaping and reflecting national identity. Their works reflected moral, political, and artistic tension, and they often used classical reforms to express uniquely English concerns. We looked at Spenser as a case in point. His writing reveals the ambition to define a truly English voice. And to help you retain the key influences on this period, here's a quick mnemonic. To remember the key forces that shaped English Renaissance literature, just think C.H.I.P. C is for court culture. Poetry was often written for patrons and served to show wit, loyalty, and grace. H is for humanism, a return to Greek and Roman thought that valued reason and individual expression. I is for identity, particularly English nationalism, which grew as England distanced itself from the Catholic Europe. P is for Protestantism, the religious movement that shaped both the ethics and imagination of the time. Remembering these four pillars will not only help you recall details but will also help you structure strong thematic exam answers. This wraps up this foundation lesson. In the next video, we'll look at how these Renaissance values appear in practice through the life and work of Edmund Spenser. We'll explore how he embodies C.H.I.P. in his writing, how the Fairy Queen and other works work as both the national epic and moral allegory, and how his background influenced his poetic identity. Thank you for joining in. All the best for your exams. Do add your comments to let me know how you found it. So, if you found this video helpful and would like to learn more, be sure to like, share and subscribe to Your Learn Lab. See you in the next one. Until then, happy learning.